Welcome to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Kentucky attorney Jeff Roberts has over 25 years of experience. He'll provide answers to your questions related to personal injury and automobile accidents, workers' compensation claims, and Social Security disability benefits. Let's join Jeff for this episode.
This is Jeff Roberts. The next episode that you're getting ready to hear talks about the tornado damage in Kentucky from the December 10th tornado, and specifically referencing the damage in Mayfield, Kentucky, and at the candle factory there. Mayfield is near and dear to my heart. That's where I was born and raised. Still have family living over there. Still live very close to that area as well. This episode is to give people information. This is not in any way my attempt to solicit any business as a result of that, or to try to influence anything from that standpoint. This is not a solicitation. It's information for individuals who are involved in that tornado or have damage as a result of that tornado. And I want to make sure everybody understands this is for informational purposes, not for advertisement purposes.
All right, friends, we're back with Jeff Roberts again, and today we're going to talk about something that's near to dear to a lot of us down here in Western Kentucky. Obviously, not too long ago, we had a series of some pretty catastrophic tornadoes that kind of ripped through here and caused an awful lot of damage and problems and tragedy for a lot of families. And, you know, the legal community kind of picked that up, and obviously the news picked that up, and people were talking, and there's a lot of opinions going on. And you look at the situation, you know, in particular at the Mayfield candle factory and things like that, and, you know, trying to figure out what recourse do the people really have. And interestingly enough, Jeff Roberts has been asked to present again this year at a very large workers' compensation continuing legal education seminar. It's the state's largest legal education seminar for workers' comp. And Jeff's going to talk on that topic. In fact, we're going to record that all tomorrow. And Jeff, I really wanted to just kind of let you dig into this a little bit, because I know a lot of people in the community here in the region, you know, have questions. Because yes, this was a very tragic tornado, but these, you know, tornadoes come through here from time to time. There's different types of damages that happen. But let's kind of key in on this, and you know, obviously not everybody's going to have access to that conference coming up, but this might be a good opportunity to let you kind of talk to your audience about some of the things to consider. So welcome back, and then let's jump in.
Good to see you, Jim. Yeah, and it is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, as I think you know, and a lot of some of the listeners know. You know, I was born and raised in Mayfield, so the tornado literally hit close to my home, but hit home with me as well. And most of my family still lives in Graves County, and luckily my immediate family didn't have any significant damage. I've got some cousins who lost everything in the tornado from there. And after the tornado hit, of course, it was devastating for all of Kentucky, but a large swath of the center of Kentucky got hit by that tornado. And in you know, Mayfield and the candle factory was in the news heavily, because obviously they had a great loss of life. It collapsed on all the workers that were present. And in the legal circles, there was talk among the lawyers really on what types of coverage would be available, or you know, what types of recourse would these workers have because of the tornado hitting their place of employment. And it reached into the media. I know, in fact, I had some attorneys refer to media people they knew that had questions, and reached out to them about workers' comp coverage in these settings, and they called Jeff Roberts. He's actually in that area, and workers' comp is what he does a great deal of. And so so I actually had a little conversations with some about that, and then was asked to present on that topic at the Comp Ed seminar coming up. And it's what we tend to refer to these types of things as are acts of God. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying God intended this to happen whatsoever. I don't think that at all. But acts of God basically are things beyond humans' control, and that's just a good way to look at it. Tornadoes, any type of storms, flooding, lightning strikes, things of that nature, all kind of come under that same umbrella. And the courts have dealt with, in the workers' comp setting, when those have happened on the job, the courts have kind of had to struggle with that. On how that is or is not going to be covered, because what is covered as far as an on-the-job injury, at least in Kentucky, is any work-related traumatic event or cumulative trauma arising out of and in the course of employment. Well, the defense attorney is going to argue the tornado wasn't work-related. That had nothing to do with the job that the person was doing, had nothing to do with the work that they were doing, and it didn't arise out of the employment, so therefore it should not be covered. In Kentucky and a lot of other states have developed different legal theories and things to deal with different fact scenarios. The one that comes into play from the standpoint of this is what is there's a couple of different ones that come into play. One is what's commonly referred to as the positional risk doctrine in Kentucky, and that's been used in a variety of different ways. A traveling employee who's injured at somebody runs a red light while they're driving to their to a job site, and they have a wreck. Are they going to be covered in that setting? And depending on the situation, yes, they will be. Some situations aren't, but generally it's going to be.
I was doing that as a normal scope of my work. I was a sales rep. I was going to my next appointment,
Correct.
or I'm a delivery driver.
Yeah, exactly. If the travel is part of your work, it's going to be covered. If you're going from your home to the factory you work at and you have the wreck, it's not going to be covered. But if part of your job requires you to travel and you're injured during that travel, it's going to be covered in that setting. And that's where positional risk really kind of started developing, was under that type of setting where it was the traveling employee. And then there was a situation in Kentucky, anyway, a case where the gentleman was working at he was a repair person, and he'd gone to a company that he's going to be repairing some machinery on. But the building he had to be in was quite a ways away from the parking lot and the gate where he checked in, and was walking there and tripped over some stuff, some concrete that was messed up, tripped and fell, and they said, well, even in that situation, it's going to be covered from there. And then there's been lightning strikes where the court had said in Kentucky that if you're at work and something about the work makes it more likely that this could occur, if you're working in a metal building, which obviously can draw lightning, and you get struck, then you have an increased risk because of your employment, and it gets covered. I haven't seen a case in Kentucky that dealt with a tornado like we had back in December, but there are some cases and some case law that comes into play. One of them basically, and I think this is the best language for coverage in there, but one of them essentially says if your work assignment places you at the area where you're exposed to the danger, then what caused the danger doesn't matter. Your work is what placed you in the dangerous place, and therefore it's covered under workers' compensation.
So the fact that this individual or individuals were actively working,
yes,
that covers it more or less.
That covers it,
or could cover it.
Yeah, that would, at least in my opinion, the way that language is written in that case in Kentucky, that they were in the dangerous place where the injury occurred because they were at work at the candle factory. And if they'd been a half mile one direction or the other away from the path, they wouldn't have had any injuries whatsoever. And so I think that, at least in my opinion, that clearly makes it work-related under Kentucky law. But there's some other theories that can kick into play. as well in that regard, but that's the best one from my perspective. That's the best argument that we have from there. The increased risk also comes into play to some extent, which they've used for lightning strikes in Kentucky. And in my opinion, the increased risk involved here is that the building they were in came down on top of them. I actually happened to be. My father lives on the other side of where the candle factory is. Luckily, his house didn't get damaged far enough away from the path that he was fine. But I was going to check on him and came close to where the candle factory was and saw the damage the very Saturday morning after the tornado hit late Friday night, and the damage was just devastating
Right.
to
Right.
look at, and luckily I didn't have to live through it. I can't imagine what it would have been like if you were actually there from that standpoint, but. There's some case law outside of Kentucky that basically says if a windstorm, hurricane, tornado type causes a wall of the building to come down on top of you or the roof to come down on top of you that is covered, there the part of the structure itself is what injured you. And I think that kind of comes in play on the increased risk. They're in a metal building, and the injuries you're going to receive from that are going to be different than injuries received in possibly a different type of structure. So I think you come into play, and they were. I've talked to some of the workers there at the candle factory, and they were instructed on where they were supposed to go and things of that nature. So they were kind of placed in these locations to some extent from that perspective. So I think that comes in, and at least in my opinion, is going to make it covered as far as their covered employment from a workers' compensation perspective.
Now you bring up an interesting point. You said that laws from outside of Kentucky. Workers' comp is a Kentucky state, state directed concept, right? I mean, workers' comp is state level. So it could be different in Indiana or Illinois or even Tennessee. But so this law from outside of Kentucky can actually apply in this case. How does that happen?
What it would happen is you would. It's not what's called binding authority. So the judge deciding the case cannot look at it and say, "I've got to rely on this case." What they can look at it and say, "There's no Kentucky case directly on point." I think the reasoning of this court is the best way to apply or to analyze this situation. So I'm going to adopt the reasoning here until an appellate court in Kentucky or to address it, a judge making the decision can rely on a state or a case from another state. Once Kentucky courts address the issue specifically, then they can no longer do that.
Right.
They've
then,
got
then
to.
they kind of come back to what has Kentucky said previously.
Yeah, exactly. They're required to rely on Kentucky law
Okay.
From that standpoint. And the other side of the increased risk that I think comes into play, and there's actually a case out of another state again on that. Kentucky talks about increased risk in regard to lightning strikes, but another case in regard to a tornado situation basically said that because the worker could not leave the building, that created the increased risk from that because they were required to stay where the tornado was traveling.
Right.
And at least there are reports that came out afterwards that said that workers, I'm not saying this is true or not true, I don't know.
Right.
But I know there were reports where workers said they went to the supervisor and said, tornadoes, it's tornadoes all over. Sirens are going off. Can we go home? And we're told, no, you've got to stay here. Or if you go home, you're fired, which is the same as saying you got to stay here, in my opinion, at least under Kentucky law.
Yeah.
From that standpoint, so they were in the zone of danger because they were there from because of their employment and were either instructed they couldn't go home or told if you go home you're getting fired. So you basically that is at least coercion from that standpoint, and I think would kick in and say they were at an increased risk because of their employment and they couldn't leave because of their job duties at that point. So I think that's another avenue for this to be covered under Kentucky's workers' compensation law. The final avenue I think that it causes it to be covered under Kentucky's workers' compensation law is what's called the operating premises rule, and that I don't think it applies as much as the positional risk does. The positional risk, I think, covers it, and so I don't think you even have to really worry about the operating premises. But that kind of says if you're injured on the operating premises of the employer, then it's covered from that unless it's something exclusive to you. And so I think that kicks in and would cover it in this situation as well. But
So an example of that could be if if I've pulled up for my shift, gotten out of my car, and I'm walking to the factory, and something happens, that last case would apply.
exactly, and that's that's where it's been primarily utilized as an exception to the going and coming rule, which is if you're going from your work to your job site and you're in a car wreck, you're not covered. The operating premises has been used when, like, the parking lot for your employer is on the other side of a public street and you get hit by a car crossing the public street after you park to come in. And it says, well, because you put the public street basically between the parking lot and the place of business, that's part of the operating premises. And so
You got to go from point A to point B.
Exactly. And so the injury is covered from that setting. And that is kind of that's the reason I said I don't think the operating premises as strong of an argument, just because it's primarily used for employees coming to work or going from work and getting hurt, traveling to their vehicle or something of
So
that
the other
nature.
legal theories, the other rules we've talked about are probably stronger, and this could apply, but it doesn't necessarily add much at this point.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And another thing that was discussed and still being discussed actually is over the lawsuit that has been filed against the candle factory itself, Mayfield Consumer Products, and the viability of that civil lawsuit outside of workers' comp. Workers' comp is one type of remedy. There's been a personal injury claim filed that would go to circuit court instead of to workers' compensation, and there's been at least discussion about whether that is a viable claim or not a viable claim to be pursued from that standpoint. And from the standpoint of a workers' comp claim, what the legal aspect that comes in is what's a term called election of remedies, and that is a legal concept that says if you elect or choose to pursue this one remedy, then it can preclude you from seeking another type of remedy. So if you pursue a workers' compensation claim, does that exclude you or preclude you from pursuing another type of claim? And some have argued that it does, that you do have an election of remedies in this type of setting. I think it kind of depends to some extent on whether that would apply. First off, the lawsuit, at least in regard to the candle factory in Mayfield, the lawsuits against MCP, the owners and the one who operated the candle factory, as I understand it, and some of the workers were working for leasing agencies or staffing agencies, and so their workers' compensation claim is against the leasing company or the staffing company, not MCP. And so them pursuing a claim against the MCP is clearly allowed. There's absolutely no question about that.
So the person going through the temp or the staffing agency still can go after EMCP.
They can go after the Mayfield Consumer Products from the standpoint of the election of remedies. There is not an election of remedies because they're pursuing two different companies in that setting.
Okay.
So they haven't elected a remedy against their employer and then suing their employer in circuit court. Now, there is a provision called the exclusive remedy of the Workers' Compensation Act that may prohibit pursuing a claim against Mayfield Consumer Products, but the election of remedies does not come into play in that setting. Now, employees who were employees of Mayfield Consumer Products, then the question comes in: do they have an election of remedies? And I know we're getting very, very legal and technical here, but this is an area where you have to be to some extent. Unfortunately, I can't be anywhere but that because it's somewhat of a confusing area. The only place that I see an election of remedies applies in a workers' compensation setting is if you sue the employer under the theory that they intentionally caused your injury. And if you do that, the statute does say if you think the employer intentionally caused your injury, that is a way around the exclusive remedy provision of the Workers' Compensation Act. But it also says there, but you have to, if you pursue that, you forego your workers' compensation claim by doing that. And so if you're arguing that Mayfield Consumer Products intentionally caused the injury to you, then I think that would to rise to the level of an election of remedies if you work for Mayfield Consumer Products, if you were their employer or employee, excuse me. I think that's the only setting that the election of remedy comes into play in a workers' compensation case. And at least as I read the complaint or looked at the complaint, I hadn't read the complaint completely that was filed or the amended complaint that was filed. I don't think they alleged in there a claim that Mayfield Consumer Products intentionally caused these injuries to their workers. They've alleged a variety of things, but that MCP intended these injuries is not something that they've alleged in there. And frankly, I think it would be very odd to allege something like that in the complaint, to be honest with you, and I don't think they would have any facts to back up. They intended the tornado
it'd be a bit of a stretch in this case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have to look at it from that perspective. So I think that whether the claim will be successful or not, that civil case will be successful or not, will be up to the court system. But they've alleged some things that I think will actually get them around the exclusive remedy potentially get them around the exclusive remedy of the Workers' Compensation Act. And I don't think there's a problem with the workers pursuing their workers' compensation claim and being involved in that civil lawsuit, at least as I see that civil lawsuit at this point in time.
Right. So, and again, this is developing still. Correct. I mean, it's been a few months, but a lawsuit of this nature takes quite a while to gather up the facts and really prepare the case properly, and there's going to be more information coming out, I would think. So
correct.
This is based on what you know now.
Yeah, a civil lawsuit, it takes a long time to process, and especially, I mean, this is going to it would take a long time in normal settings. This tornado upset the court system in Graves County as well, which is where this lawsuit would be venued at. And the circuit judge, the circuit court clerk, and administrative office of the courts and all have done an amazing job of getting the court working in a remote location now and up and running and moving cases forward in, frankly, a faster time frame than I ever imagined that they would get that done. But it's not an ideal situation like having your own the normal courtroom where you can do jury trials and things of that nature. So it is going to delay jury trials to some extent until they can get a good process set up to where they can try cases back in Graves County with a jury trial anyway. So I think that's going to delay things a little bit as well. And you've got a lot of process of going through discovery and taking depositions and things. So, what the proof develops there will be what it is, and that will establish whether they have a viable claim outside of the Workers' Compensation Act or not. But at least in my setting, anybody that was at work at the candle factory has a viable workers' compensation claim. And
And that's your legal opinion. You've done this for quite a long time.
correct, exactly. That's my legal opinion from that standpoint. And I'm probably one of the few attorneys in Kentucky who's handled a tornado case before.
Yeah.
I've represented a gentleman who was a traveling employee and drove as part of his work. And unfortunately, during a storm, his car got caught up in a tornado and he got seriously injured in that accident. And I was successful in his case from that standpoint. So I've got personal experience of being successful in a tornado or quote unquote act of God type of case
In Kentucky.
in Kentucky in the past. And as far as I'm aware right now, I know some people, some other attorneys handling candle factory cases or employees who were injured at the candle factory. I have some myself, and as far as I know, I don't know of any of the insurance companies for the different companies that were staffing workers there or MCP itself that's actually taking the position that these aren't covered.
Right.
But right now we're early on in the process, and frankly, I've seen the insurance companies do it before. Optics wise, they're going to cover it now. A year from now, when these are in front of a judge, they very well may, and I suspect some of them will take a very different position on whether it's covered or not covered at that point in time. Right now, they don't want the bad optics
Right.
of not covering these cases. So.
Right. So again, everything kind of develops and evolves.
Correct.
Until you actually get there. Jeff, you'd mentioned as we were talking about the damage to the courthouse and the legal infrastructure there in Graves County. And you mentioned jury trials. I mean, you want to talk a little bit about workers' comp in general. Workers' comp is an administrative law process, so it's not really a jury trial. So that is different
Yes.
in this situation, right?
Yeah. Yes. The workers' compensation claims are, lack of a better word, tried to an administrative law judge. It's not a true trial as people think of it.
It's not what you see on TV.
It's not what you see on TV from that standpoint. Most of it is done long before you get in front of the judge, and then it's given to the judge, like the medical records and doctor's testimony is either done in writing or by a deposition, and that's just given to the judge for the judge to review and read themselves from there. So actually the final process that you do in front of a judge is usually just the claimant's, the injured worker's testimony to the judge about how this injury has affected them, and then being cross-examined on any prior injuries and prior problems they may have had from there. But it's not tried to a jury. It doesn't. You're not in the courthouse setting there all day long doing that aspect, and then it just strictly goes to a judge who does nothing but workers' compensation cases. The administrative law judge that handles the cases doing them only workers' compensation cases. And in Kentucky, I believe there's 16, maybe 18 workers' comp judges throughout the state of Kentucky, and they travel. The closest judge now, the closest judges we have now are located in Bowling Green as far as Western Kentucky goes. But if they try to have the cases assigned to the hearing location closest to where the claimant lives, the injured worker lives. Paducah is the closest hearing site we have, even though we're really not doing in-person hearings right now because of the pandemic. But as a general rule, and we hopefully we'll be opening back up to in-person hearings before too long. The claimant doesn't have to travel to Bowling Green; they would go to Paducah to the hearing site if it's a local. What I call true Western Kentucky, then they're going to go to Bowling Green, and I can't remember how many hearing sites, but the hearing sites are located throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky, so that even though the judges are in Bowling Green, you got a hearing site closer to you than that would be.
That makes a lot of sense in terms of just the accessibility and being able to get your hearing in front of the judge when that time happens.
Correct.
Jeff, any last minute thoughts about this tragedy? I mean, obviously, as you said, you've got a few clients involved in this. You've looked at this obviously already. What would you tell the community? I think a lot of it's give it time. Let the process work. I would think would be a big part of it.
As far as the people affected by the tornado, especially the ones that were at work when it happened, yeah, give it time. Pursue the claim, and get better. See your doctor, get treated, get yourself improved from that standpoint. I know obviously there are a lot of people who have homeowners type of claims as a result of this as well, and I've already heard some stories in regard to that. And it's another thing I've talked in other things about making sure you got adequate coverage for your car insurance and things of that nature applies to homeowner claims, because I've talked to people who aren't getting the types of coverage they thought they were going to get because their policy limits or weren't what they thought they were, or because things weren't covered. They had one thing and they replaced it. And in fact, frankly, I went and did that on mine after I talked to some folks and figured out that I've got one piece of equipment insured that I hadn't had for a couple of years, and what I replaced it with has not been added to my insurance, and I've got to get that corrected. And so even I am subject to making those kind of mistakes, but now's the time to make sure you go back in and check that coverage. And Kentucky, the Mayfield area has been, of course, I'm born and raised there, so I knew the type of people that live and work in Mayfield. And, it's amazing to me how they came together to support each other during this period of time. And then the state as a whole came in, and even outside of the state. And it's really, the tragedy, how tragic it is cannot be overstated, don't get me wrong from that standpoint, but it also has brought out the best in mankind to a large extent from that, and that's been good to see. All the volunteers, all the people we've had, there's been people come to Mayfield and other areas hit in Kentucky. I'm not just limiting it to Mayfield, that have traveled several hundreds of miles to come in and help take care of the people that have suffered injuries and suffered loss of life and loss of damages or loss of property because of this, and to love on them. And it's been something really good to see from that. I wish it never occurred, and I never did have to see it, but I'm really glad that we live in a country where people come together like that.
Well, Jeff, I don't want to try to add anything to that. I think that's heartfelt, and I think that's honest, and I think that's probably a good way to wrap up this episode. And just, I appreciate your time, appreciate your candor on this, and wish you the best of luck as this case proceeds.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Jeff will return in 2 weeks. Until then, he invites you to visit jeffrobertslaw.com and follow his firm on Facebook. At the Roberts Law Office, you'll find a history of small town service and big city results.